Apologies to everybody who's turned up who are big A.D. Lindsay fans. I thought the guy was unknown but interestingly right. I think now he's unknown and wrong, and I felt a bit conflicted about doing a paper about somebody who gets marks wrong and you've never heard of him. There are interesting things to be said about it, but I'll have to think about it in more wheat chaff separating and write it up. But so instead I'm looking at somebody who's clearly important, Karl Kautsky, famously the Pope of Marx in the Second International, or Pope of Marxism, the guy who, to some extent, simplified and systematised the Marxist corpus, though he did develop it himself. And as people I know, I'm particularly interested in socialist attitudes to the proletariat. It's odd because socialists write a lot about capitalism. They write surprisingly little about the proletariat, the modern wage-earning working class. This includes Marx himself and Marx's successors. And in some respects, Kautsky is in this tradition. He doesn't write that much directly about the proletariat as such. But you can find quite a lot of material in a way more systematically than you can find in Marx on attitudes to the proletariat. And I've looked at various things. Probably most useful was his very large book on the agrarian question he published in 1899, which is really part of the debate about revisionism in the German socialist movement, which has been translated and published in English in 2 volumes, but also untranslated unfortunately still, but his anti-critique, which is his response to Bernstein in the debate about revisionism. But I tried to extract out of this what he says about the proletariat and the relationship to socialism. It's a synthetic account, so I don't pay very much attention to how he changes an opinion, though that does come up a bit and could come up more perhaps in the discussion. And because I've been trying to be relatively systematic, some of it you'll think that's a bit obvious, some of it hopefully a bit less obvious. But just to kick off, what he says about classes which might be candidates for progressive politics but are not. Some of them, the benign, philanthropic rich, he doesn't say very much about. He himself is of bourgeois background, but he agrees more or less with Marx that such people are always going to be in a small minority. But he does say more about the wider labouring population. It's only the wage-earning proletariat which is a social agency which bears the socialist movement. And this is not because they're the poorest in society. The modern proletariat, he says, is not characterised by poverty. Peasants and artisans, for example, worked obsessively to preserve their small property, and for the same reason they tended to accept lower standards of living than those expected by wage labourers. Even when semi-proletarianised, peasants and handicraft workers were simply too attached to the residual private property, productive property, to develop any widespread sympathy for socialism. Indeed, so long as workers believe that they can become independent with their own productive property, they would resist socialism. And to quote, "Although individuals live in the present, they work for the future. The industrial wage labourer who still believes that handicrafts have a future, or the journeyman who fancies himself a master, is different to one who has abandoned any hope of becoming independent within the present-day mode of production. If you believe you can be an independent producer in the present-day mode of production, you will not be a socialist." Peasants and handicraft workers, moreover, were accustomed to working on their own, and so they lacked the common feeling and discipline of the industrial worker, and this discipline matters quite a lot to Kautsky. Those individuals schooled in socialised labour by the capitalist enterprise, and in whom the organised struggle against capitalist exploitation has fostered the virtues of cooperation, trust in one's comrades and voluntary submission to the collective. That's what characterises for Kautsky the modern proletariat: trust in one's comrades and voluntary submission to the collective. We'll come back to this. It's a slightly disconcerting view of the working class. The proletarian was in a position of antagonism with the employer, but as a consumer was also in conflict with all those who owned or possessed their means of production, including peasants and small shopkeepers. They were in antagonistic relationship with employers who paid the wages, but also an antagonistic relationship to those for whom they were consumers, the peasant and the artisan. Socialism, therefore, could not be built upon a common interest with small property owners, no matter how exploited those small property owners may be. Historically, the small property owning class had been the foundation stone for the democratic movement, and Kautsky very freely acknowledges this. This, however, by the late 19th century had changed. Hundreds of years ago, the small tradesman far surpassed all other classes in intelligence, self-reliance and courage. Today, the proletariat vigorously develops these virtues, while the small tradesman has become the prototype of narrowness, servility and cowardice. Continuously under pressure from both big capitalists and wage earners, they inclined towards political hysteria and were prey to demagogues. They had become what Kautsky called a reactionary democracy. The collapse of the petty bourgeois democratic movement into rabid hostility to the organised proletariat, Kautsky argued in 1909, was even more advanced in France, Austria and Switzerland than in Germany. Social democracy has no more bitter enemy than the reactionary democracy. The capitalist mode of production also produces a new middle class of intellectuals, professional scholars, artists, engineers, officials and so on. They lack, however, a coherent consciousness of their own, the interests of each section being too particular. This growing class, despite its lack of property, is not at all a promising recruiting ground for the socialist movement. The slum or the lumpen proletariat, the unemployable, indigent or criminal, is superfluous to production, though constituting a considerable proportion of the population in industrial areas. It is generally servile to the powerful. It cannot take the lead in the revolutionary movement, though it may well fish in the troubled water of revolutionary outbreaks. So to the proletariat proper. For Kautsky, the true proletarian was the worker without prospect of ever becoming independent. So it's not just current situation, but future situation and future expectations. The proletarian indeed had the same will to live as any other class, but this will to live worked out under conditions appropriate to their class-defined means of life. Proletarians do not strive for profits, but to sell their labour power. They naturally looked for higher prices for labour power and low prices for food. This is the elemental foundation of proletarian class consciousness. Now, Kautsky acknowledged that at the time of the beginning of modern industry, the term proletariat implied absolute degeneracy. Historically, during early industrialisation, the proletariat was recruited out of the shiftless, semi-criminal slum classes, such as could be found whether in ancient Rome or indeed, Kautsky said, the slums of modern Turkey and modern London. London slums had a particularly bad reputation for some reason. They were a rabble with little political consciousness. However, the modern industrial proletariat was an absolutely unprecedented phenomenon. For the first time, they emerged as a hereditary class, radically distinct from their employers. Some of this comes from Marx, some of it I think comes from 1830s French socialist thinkers, particularly the notion of a hereditary class, and perhaps from Lorenz von Stein. Kautsky wrote, in marked contrast to the industry of the Middle Ages, in modern industry, the economic establishment is completely separated from the household. During the Guild period, workers in a craft workshop belonged to the household, to the family of the master. Workers could not establish their own household. They could not marry and raise a family without first establishing themselves as an independent economic unit, without becoming masters themselves. In contrast, household and factory are separate in modern industry. Workers can set up their own homes and families without first having to become independent artisans. And as we know, they make good use of the opportunity. That is, they have a lot of sex and a lot of babies. Wage workers multiply and become a distinct class. So a point here that the proletariat, Kautsky argued, is a hereditary self-reproducing class in a way that traditionally the wage earner had not been. The wage earner as a class, you fell into the class, but the class did not reproduce of itself, did not become hereditary. Now, this separation of household and factory was crucial in allowing the modern proletariat to develop a cohesive class consciousness, because it allowed the wage earner to become a free individual outside work and to develop the qualities which make it possible for the proletariat to conquer and to retain state power. Unlike the proletarians of the ancient and medieval world, the modern proletariat supplies the wants of the ruling class rather than being supplied by it. They do not envy and imitate the rich, but despise them as idlers. It was this changing consciousness that made the modern working class. The sense of power that goes with the class consciousness means the regeneration of the working class. Large-scale industry inevitably led to the progressive concentration of the mass of the population and economic life in large cities. This concentration and urbanisation was crucial to the development of proletarian class consciousness. Workers can communicate and organise themselves more easily in towns. They are more difficult to control and to discipline. The multiplicity of opportunities for employment means that someone who has been disciplined can always expect to find a new job elsewhere. The town stimulated individualism and intellectual exchange through innumerable associations, meetings, exhibitions, museums, theatres and pubs. It was in the industrial town that the proletariat first collected in masses, attained class consciousness, organised itself and achieved political maturity. So I want to talk about a polarity in Kautsky's discussion between degradation and culture. Two contrary tendencies, Kautsky argued, acted on the proletariat under capitalism. On the one hand, they were degraded by demoralising work and poverty. With industrialisation, the working class decayed fearfully, both physically and morally. It visibly degenerated from year to year. This absolute degeneration, however, is only a transitional stage. Generally speaking, industrialisation improved living standards for workers, leading on average to shorter working hours, higher wages and more hygienic conditions. Workers, moreover, strove to regenerate themselves, in the first instance by limiting the working day. Kautsky disagreed with the common idea that social revolution arises out of proletarian misery and degradation. Over time, he said, inevitably the elevating tendency of the proletariat gains the upper hand. Nonetheless, even in best circumstances, the proletariat were deprived of culture, having no leisure to acquire it and being intellectually deadened by mindlessly tending machines. However, the worker was anxious to escape the workplace so as to develop their potential. The very process of modern production, bringing workers together in urban areas, broke down the limited vistas of rural life, commingling cultures and requiring literacy, and this reacts upon the proletarian's intellectual life and awakens in her a thirst for knowledge. The proletarian has a craving to exercise his mind outside of his hours of work. Unlike the bourgeois intellectual, increasingly limited to esoteric specialisms, like the life and thinking of Karl Kautsky, the worker tries to embrace all domains of knowledge. It is among the despised and ignorant proletariat that the philosophical spirit of the brilliant members of the Athenian aristocracy is revived, said Kautsky in rather vivid language. At least by 1916, the desire for proletarians to educate themselves and their increasing capacity and the increasing capacity of society to educate them was for Kautsky their crucial role. Crucial to the historical role. He said, if we expect better results from the class struggle of the modern proletariat and from the struggles of the working compared to the struggles of the working classes of previous times, the essential reason is the greater thirst for knowledge and the greater educational opportunities of the modern worker. The struggle of the working class over wages could not of its own overcome the degradation of capitalism or reverse its increasing tendency towards crisis. The evolution of the working class brought about with the class struggle, therefore, is more moral than economic. However, the moral elevation of the working class generates increasing discontent at the constraints imposed by the capitalist order. As is probably clear, Marx, Engels, Kautsky at least by the late 1890s, well, actually by the early 1990s, thought that the living standards of the working class were going up. Initially, he argued this is because of a decline in agricultural prices, making food and other such commodities cheaper. By the turn of the century, he is ascribing it more to social economic reform. Following the advice of Engels, Kautsky concentrated not on the poverty of the working class, but on the uncertainty of their means of existence as that which radicalises them. Of all the ills which attend the present system of production, the most trying, that which harrows men's souls deepest and pulls up by the roots every instinct of conservatism, is the permanent uncertainty of a livelihood. Kautsky remarked ironically, in this context, Kautsky said something about emigration, migration, which is relevant to our own considerations. What lessons we can draw from it might be a different matter. Kautsky remarked ironically in the constant stream of emigration engendered by international transport. He said, "Steamships and railroads, these much vaunted pillars of civilization, not only carry guns, liquor and syphilis to the barbarians, they also bring the barbarians and their barbarism to us." UKIP might say that, I suppose. The swarms of the unemployed were a social danger, merging with that stupendous mass of humanity of all degrees that may be designated as the slums, in which he included cheats and swindlers, criminals and prostitutes, and sundry social parasites with no useful function, a category in which Kautsky included middlemen, saloon keepers, commercial agents, personal servants, most soldiers, and oddly enough, drummers. In the first instance, workers are likely to resent the influx of foreigners undermining wages. They learn, however, that the only sure counter to this is international solidarity, opposing capitalist oppression across borders. The modern proletarian, him or herself often required to migrate for work, is less likely to suffer from narrow national chauvinism. Talk now what about Kautsky thought about the worker movement as such. As the unskilled worker can be easily replaced by the employer, workers' self-organisation tends first to develop among the skilled working class, and the proletariat therefore differentiates into two sections. The best organised and most skilled worker comes to look upon themselves as an aristocracy of labour. They exclude unskilled workers from the craft unions and act in effect as the worst enemies of the working class. This division is overcome, however, with ever-increasing mechanisation, which tumbles various crafts into the abyss of common labour. Section by section, the unskilled workers emulate the best organised sections of the labour movement and emerge from the moral apathy. By this process of emergence and sorting, there develops a labour vanguard, the church militant, as Kautsky called it, of the working class, which grows at a faster pace than the class as a whole. From this militant proletariat is recruited the bulk of the socialist movement. Indeed, socialism and the militant proletariat tended constantly to become identical, he said. The first weapons of the modern proletariat were the strike and the boycott. The strike in particular was the weapon of warfare peculiar to the proletariat, a purely proletarian weapon. Though the strike was likely to play an important part in the revolutionary process, it was insufficient, however, for the struggle of a large-scale working class. Workers must inevitably seek political liberties to organise at a mass scale. Civil and political liberties are to the proletariat the prerequisites of life. They are the light and air of the labour movement. While rich capitalists can influence governments directly, the working class can only do so, Kautsky said, through parliamentary activity. The struggle to influence Parliament for the working class is the most powerful lever that can be utilised to raise the proletariat out of its economic, social and moral degradation. The working class is particularly well adapted to political organisation for the regular forms of activity. The working class is particularly adapted to this form of parliamentary party organisation because it is trained by the regular forms of activity at work, which accustom them, he said, to rigid discipline, which Kautsky saw as a good thing. Working class participation in politics inevitably leads to a specifically class party. Sooner or later, in every capitalist country, the participation of the working class in politics must lead to the formation of an independent party, a Labour Party. And Kautsky was of the opinion that a class party of workers must sooner or later exhibit socialist tendencies. If not socialist in the beginning, it must become so in the end. For Kautsky, therefore, the proletarian class struggle takes a socialist direction by its very nature. This is distinction, by the way, from a tendency to elide the notion of at least traditional views of Lenin, of socialism being brought from the outside. This is clearly not how Kautsky looked on it. There's certain overlaps. Oh, sorry. Kautsky's argument that a worker movement inevitably develops socialist tendencies is obviously in contrast to at least the traditional view of Leninism, that socialism must be brought from the outside, which is not to say that I think altogether that Lenin and Kautsky agree, but that's another matter. For Kautsky, therefore, the proletarian class struggle takes a socialist direction by its very nature. This is not just because socialism was in the object interest of the wage earner, or the objective interest of the wage earner. In fact, Kautsky thought the rural population had a greater interest in socialism than even the urban working class. The spontaneous development of socialist consciousness in the proletariat had a double aspect. Firstly, as the proletariat is propertyless, it is possible to win it over to the abolition of private property and production. Secondly, as the proletariat is exploited, it will strive to put an end to this exploitation. Now, Kautsky did admit that exploitation of the working class was a somewhat abstract notion. If, as Marx argued, labour power is sold at its market value, it can hardly be immediately obvious to workers that they are being robbed. This is particularly the case if technical exploitation by Marxist standards, perhaps even rising exploitation, coexists with rising wages, and Kautsky thought it could and did. Kautsky conceded that the mass of workers neither carry on statistical research nor ponder over the theories of value and surplus value, which is very true. Workers would perceive their exploitation, however, but the rise of massive profits and the improving mode of living of the bourgeoisie. For the classes are not divided by Chinese walls. That the standard of life in the bourgeoisie rises faster than among the workers can be seen at every step. Workers are more likely to see themselves as exploited if the entrepreneurs were foreign. This partly explained, Kautsky said, in the early 20th century, the intense class antagonisms in Tsarist Russia, because very often their employers were of Germanic descent. If, on the other hand, it was the working class who were divided by nationality or deluged by immigrants, as was the case in the United States, then class consciousness had great difficulty in emerging. So that's in the spontaneous worker movement. The next stage is dictatorship of the proletariat. After that, we'll talk about workers in a socialist state. I say dictatorship of the proletariat, talk about it at this stage. It's worth bearing in mind that for Kautsky, as for other socialists, the dictatorship of the proletariat is not the same thing as the Socialist Party coming to power. It needs to be remembered that Engels and Marx referred to the Paris Commune as the dictatorship of the proletariat, but they did not think the Paris Commune was socialist. So there's a distinction. The dictatorship of the proletariat is a worker party coming to power, regardless of whether it's got a socialist programme or not, in Kautsky's thinking. Nonetheless, for Kautsky, the political organisation of a workers' party campaigning for state power was inevitable. However, the proletariat, once in power, cannot use the first great victory over capital, which puts the political power into its hands, otherwise than by way of abolishing the capitalist nexus. Working class government would be the dictatorship of the proletariat, which Kautsky interpreted as meaning the exclusive political role of the proletariat, not in alliance with any other class. This would, in the first instance, achieve the transformation of the militaristic state into a culture state, as I think you took that term from Wilhelm Liebknecht, which assumes responsibility for education, provision for the poor, healthcare and transport. For Kautsky, such a government takes a socialist direction by its very nature. When a working class government comes to power, it will, by force of economic circumstances, strive for full employment as the first requirement for those who live only by selling their labour power. This would be the case even if, as in England, the worker movement thought in liberal rather than socialist terms. Kautsky hypothesised that in such circumstances, capitalists would see their profitability threatened and would therefore seek to sell up to worker cooperatives and the state. This seems rather unlikely, but the example actually comes from what we were talking about in the last presentation, the land war in Ireland. The land war in Ireland, a campaign of peasants and small farmers against landlordism, led to a kind of a stalemate, but a stalemate in which landlords could no longer extract sufficient rents from the tenant farmers. Therefore, in essence, what the landlords finally decide to do is to sell out, to let the peasants have their bloody land, because you can't get rent out of them anymore. At least you can't get satisfactory rent out of them. The hypothesis that Kautsky is presenting here is something similar. You have a worker government which essentially improves the situation of the working class to such an extent that the profit margin will be virtually destroyed for capitalists, who in their despair will seek to sell out to the state or to worker cooperatives. That in essence they will seek compensation rather than struggle along trying to be capitalists when they have lost all the weapons of coercion against the working class. So even in the absence of a worker movement motivated by socialist theories explicitly, the political supremacy of the proletariat and the continuation of the capitalist mode of production are mutually incompatible. Kautsky, as it happens, was long unhappy with the notion of the dictatorship of the proletariat. He didn't like the phrase. In his reply to Bernstein, for example, the anti-critic, he said, "I do not swear that the supremacy of the proletariat must inevitably take the form of a class dictatorship. Here there is no need to tie our hands." After the experience of the Bolshevik and the Central European revolutions, Kautsky abandoned the idea of the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat altogether. Instead, in the period of transition, the government would generally assume the form of a coalition with other class parties, at least when the conquest of power by the Workers' Party was effected by democratic means. In this he's influenced by Otto Bauer in Austria. Okay. So I've talked about the worker movement, and then I've talked about the dictatorship of the proletariat. I only come now to the famous merger of the worker movement and the socialist movement, because I wanted to emphasise that the dictatorship of the proletariat is distinct from a conscious socialist government. The Class Party of Labour finds a socialist doctrine already developed to a greater or lesser extent by intellectuals. Socialism developed as an ideology in the beginning of the 19th century as the deepest and most splendid expression of bourgeois philanthropy. Early socialism wished to rescue the working class, but did not see the proletariat as an agent in its own emancipation. Indeed, as they desired a harmonious society, they positively opposed class struggle. The fledgling labour movement was naturally suspicious of such socialist intellectuals. It was, according to Kautsky, the great contribution of Marx and Engels to link socialism to the day-to-day proletarian class struggle. And to quote, "Marx and Engels achieved, in theory, the unification of the worker movement and socialism. They replaced empirical trial and error and sentimental yearnings with the clear perception that the highest form of the workers' movement is the socialist movement, and that socialism can only be realised through the workers' movement, that the workers' movement must of necessity strive to advance beyond capitalist society, and that the only class which has the power to struggle for a higher social stage beyond that of capitalism is the class of wage labourers. The unification of socialism and the worker movement was Kautsky's definition of scientific socialism. Interestingly, he ascribed its origins not to any work by Marx, actually, but to the condition of the working class in England, as written in 1844 by the 24-year-old Frederick Engels. Engels, for Kautsky, invented scientific socialism, not Marx. By degrees, the worker movement and socialism is amalgamated. Kautsky's party, the German SPD, was not a popular democratic party in the bourgeois sense of the term, but a party of class struggle. Its role was to recruit and to organise the proletariat. Once social democracy has landed the entire mass of the proletariat, he said, no power will be able to withstand it. The main task of social democracy is and remains to win over this mass, to organise it politically and economically, to elevate its intellectual and moral level, this notion of moral level again, and to bring it to the point where it can assume its inheritance, the capitalist mode of production. However, social democracy was not simply there to represent the interests of the proletariat. Rather, it was the harnessing of socialist ideas generated by intellectuals to the agency of working class power and dynamism. Social democracy is the party of the proletariat in class struggle, but it is not just this, it is also a party of social development. Bernstein famously said that the movement is everything, the end nothing. Kautsky inverted this. The aim of the movement belong together in social democracy. They are inseparable, but they should never come into conflict. But should they ever come into conflict, it will be the movement, the worker movement, which will have to give way. In other words, social development takes precedence over the interests of the proletariat. In particular, certain sections of the working class, those working in trades requiring significant skill, could coalesce as labour aristocracies and oppose progressive technical improvement as a threat to their jobs. Social democracy could not support such sectionalism. Social democracy, therefore, was not committed to supporting every sectional industrial action. I'll take one excursion from Kautsky here to quote even the left socialist Anton Pannekoek in 1912, where he said, socialists should not support, for example, dock labourers struggling against the introduction of corn elevators, even if it meant a destruction of thousands of jobs. Pannekoek said, the idea would spring up, couldn't we fight against it with trade union power? But social democracy would answer, that's impossible, we cannot fight against progress, make sure that the machines fall into your own hands. Social democracy's aim was to remove obstacles to the free activity and organisation of the proletariat and to agitate for state measures to protect the physical, intellectual and moral capacities of the proletariat, wherever the activity of individuals and the organised mass of the proletariat is unable to do so. Social democracy aimed to elevate the proletariat intellectually and morally, and to enable it to assume control of the economic mechanism. Kautsky put a great deal of emphasis upon legislation in support of a legally limited working day, or the normal working day as it is known. He basically says it's the most valuable part of capital in his famous introduction to the economic doctrines of Karl Marx. It was the main issue in the protection of the workers, a limited working day. The socialist movement could not promise workers protection of their occupational position, only their capacity for work and for life. So the socialist movement protects the workers' humanity, not their particular jobs. Last section is what Kautsky thought the position of the workers would be in the socialist order. Socialist revolution would involve the transition to a new system of property which is already latent in the old. When productive property was worked by individuals, individual ownership had been necessary. Large-scale production, on the other hand, requires cooperation and social production. Work becomes necessarily collective. It has become wholly impossible that every single worker should own his own means of production. The substitution of common for private ownership and production for use rather than for sale was inherent in the evolution of property. Separate capitalist establishments would be transformed into social institutions. These institutions in turn would be united into one large concern, a socialist commonwealth. Rather disconcertingly, socialist society would be nothing more than a single gigantic industrial concern. There is little sign in Kautsky's writing that he believed that the division of labour between manual and mental labour could be overcome. Indeed, Kautsky followed Marx in believing that science increasingly determined the productivity of labour, but he went rather further than Marx in saying that training in manual skills and training in science are two strictly separate activities. Productivity would rely upon scientists, manual workers had nothing to do with this and could have nothing to do with this. He is also deeply sceptical about the viability of worker cooperative enterprises. The single entrepreneur in particular, independent, ruthless, highly motivated, was much better at taking advantage of market opportunities. Individual cooperatives almost invariably turned into capitalist enterprises. Capitalist exploitation could only be overcome by large-scale and, it seems, hierarchical socialist enterprises. It is true that the worker demands freedom as well as good conditions of labour. He conceded when discussing guild socialism. He desires democracy to be introduced into industry, but clearly Kautsky had a limited view of what industrial democracy might mean. Democracy signifies not anarchy, but submission of the individual to the decisions of the majority and to those of the managers which the majority appoints. For Kautsky, the economic activity of the modern state was a natural starting point leading to the cooperative commonwealth. The size of this commonwealth could not be predicted in advance, but as a minimum it would likely be coterminous with the modern state. Kautsky predicted that a trade between largely self-sufficient socialist commonwealths would be much less likely, would likely be much less. He thought that international trade between socialist commonwealths would be much less than the international trade which characterised capitalism. A cooperative commonwealth, coextensive with a nation, could produce all that it requires for its own preservation, so kind of autarky. Kautsky obviously considered socialism in one country to be viable, and indeed he thought it necessary if the imperialist instinct to expansion was to be avoided. The aim of the socialist movement, therefore, was to democratise the existing state as a first stage to transforming it into a self-sufficing cooperative commonwealth. The details of how a socialist commonwealth would be organised, however, could not be predicted in advance. Intellectuals could do no more than indicate the general trend, but sketching plans for the future social state is about as rational as writing in advance the history of the next war. The only certainty was that large-scale means of production and instruments of labour would be subjected to social ownership and operation. Now, Kautsky did admit that under present conditions, the state is more expensive and less competent in its economic activities than the private capitalist. Socialisation, therefore, would be distinct from nationalisation in that there be various forms of social association other than the state, such as municipalities and cooperatives and localised enterprises. Nonetheless, as I indicated, he didn't really have a concept of what you might call industrial democracy, guild socialism or anything like that. Rather, efficiency would derive from the maintenance of certain capitalistic techniques. At least for the foreseeable future, wage differentials and productivity bonuses could be expected to continue. They were entirely reconcilable to the spirit of socialist society. The competitive spirit would have to be preserved because a certain degree of rivalry between the members of society and the selection of the fittest does seem to be an indispensable prerequisite both for social progress in society and for maintaining the level already attained. But this did not require market mechanisms. Already within capitalist enterprises, talent was rewarded and organisational hierarchies arranged without recourse to market competition. Indeed, the capitalist market was in some respects uncompetitive because it tended to reward those who with inherited unearned advantages. To quote Kautsky, a race between horses who begin at different starting points along the racetrack is a nonsense. The same is true of rivalry between people who are unequalled to begin with. The selection of the fittest can only take place among equals. The idea being that no matter how clever or hard-working you are, you're not likely to end up with more money than the new 25-year-old Duke of Westminster. Employment for all seeking work would be secured, but there would be no full freedom of labour, Kautsky thought. In a socialist society, there would in essence be only one employer, and workers obviously could not move between employers because the one employer would be the state. Kautsky admitted that this was a limitation on freedom, but it was one he believed that the proletariat would willingly acquiesce in. It can easily be understood why a liberal-minded lawyer or author may consider such a dependence unbearable, but it is not unbearable for the modern proletariat. Basically, the proletariat had rather limited horizons, he thought, at least when it came to work, and a secure job is a secure job. The anarchist ideal of individual independence outside the collective work process was impossible for the manual worker, but it would be applicable in the socialist future to the process of intellectual production, art and scholarship, which has laws of its own and cannot submit to central management. The type of socialist production, therefore, would be communism in material production, anarchy in the intellectual. This isn't an entirely agreeable utopia. There was to be no liberation in work itself. Socialism, therefore, promised to satisfy the intellectual strivings of the worker fundamentally by shortening the working day. For the worker, therefore, it is not the freedom of labour, but the freedom from labour which they seek. Last point, this freedom from labour, something which is already developing onto capitalism, the shortening of the working day, I think Kautsky always saw as very fundamental to what socialism was about. The raising of the moral, spiritual and intellectual level of the proletariat. It would acquire its fullness of development under socialism, but it is necessary for the acquirement of socialism. In his polemic with Kautsky, the anti-critique, Kautsky ends really by saying, look Kautsky, look Bernstein, have more faith in the proletariat, have more faith in their intellectual and spiritual level, because if you don't have faith in that, you can't even have faith in democracy, never mind socialism. And in the end, it's a wager. We hope that when the day comes, the working class will prove itself adequate to the tasks which is presented before it. In many respects, actually, Kautsky's partial disillusionment and certainly his polemics against Bolshevism, but also his antagonism to the majority leadership of the SPD, arose from a view that in Central Europe and Eastern Europe at least, the proletariat did not have the adequate intellectual or spiritual level to achieve socialism. And by the 1920s, rather curiously enough, Kautsky had much more faith in the worker movement in England. But I'll leave it there. Okay, thanks. Loads of stuff there, and we'll be able to mention all of it, obviously. A lone RC lead, so asked I think it's right. I mean, what's kind of significant, I think, is often forgotten, is that Lenin's not talking about bringing a socialist consciousness to the working class. He's talking about bringing a social democratic consciousness into the working class. And this connects to what Kautsky is saying, that the social democracy doesn't just represent the working class interests, it represents social progress. And so in What Is to Be Done, Lenin's making the point that, against the economists, that there are lots of issues which are not directly proletarian class issues, such as the way students keep on getting beaten up with the Tsarist police, which social democracy has to take up. because social democracy in Russia is supposed to be not just a party of the class, but a party of social progress. And he's taken that from Kautsky, you know. This is what needs to be brought into the worker movement, because the worker movement is a class movement, but the social democracy is a party of social progress. And most of the economists have no difficulty at all at saying that the working class spontaneously have the socialist consciousness, more or less. I don't think Lenin's arguing with that. He's arguing about, yes, but bringing social democracy is a different matter, because social democracy is connected to the movement of the class, but it's distinct in that sense because it's got a vision for society. It does relate to the wider question about the nature of proletarian class consciousness, which I think Kautsky's a bit inadequate on, but I think virtually all socialist thinkers are inadequate on it. It's a real difficulty because the class consciousness of the peasant or the artisan in many respects is much stronger. Because you own your farm, or you wish to own your farm, or you wish to own your workshop. There's a strong sense of proprietorship in that class consciousness. What the worker owns is labour power, which is much more, it's much vaguer, you know. How do you own your labour power? What comes out in Capital is there's a very interesting exchange which Marx has between puts in the words the voice of the employer and the voice of the worker, and he actually takes it directly from a strike leaflet, almost directly from a strike leaflet, with the workers saying, okay, I'm in a contract with you, employer, you'll give me wages, but you're trying to get too much out of me, therefore what I want is a contract with you which will allow me some respite from endless toil and labour, so I can preserve what I own, my labour power. So this sense of proletarian class consciousness is about defence of labour power, about capacity to work and to get wages. This in turn, the argument goes, leads inevitably to a socialisation of the means of production as the ultimate way of protecting labour power, and then in turn labour power becomes transcendent, as does the working class. It's coherent. It is coherent, but it does tend to lead to a class consciousness which in many respects is rather weaker than petty bourgeois class consciousness, which is much more involved in materiality of the petty property they wish to defend. So it's a problem for Kautsky, it's a problem for lots of people. And Kautsky does admit problems. I mean, the bit where he says, it's all very well to talk about exploitation, but how's that, you know, when and how will the workers feel exploited? You know, the whole point about the Trinity formula discussion in Capital is that these things are not very clear. You know, you can demonstrate all you like surplus value, but it's not intuitively obvious to somebody in the work process, and that remains a problem. Lots of other things. Yeah, the 99% I think is, whatever its agitational merits, is obviously deeply un-Marxist. You know, I suppose if you have a proletarian hegemony, then you might use it as an agitational slogan, but I don't know if such a thing exists within the broad kind of incoherent anti-systemic leftism which exists at the minute, positive as it is. The 99% slogan has got lots of problems, you know, and has an anarchist origin too, which is not the ancient proletariat. I'm sure Jeffrey just is absolutely right about that they're quite a bit cooler than Kautsky implies, you know. But Marx is always kind of, I mean, his favourite proletarian is Spartacus, who's not a proletarian, he's a slave, you know. So Marx himself is always kind of not too worried about these things. About the nature of dictatorship, I think Marx, when he talks about dictatorship, Marx does include in that cracking heads. I don't have much doubt about that. You know, he means coercion and he means intimidation. He doesn't just mean what Kautsky would like it to mean, which is, you won an election and everything's nice. You know, I think so. It's absolutely right that dictatorship does not mean a single party telling everybody what they should do, but I think from Marx it certainly does imply, it implies emergency rule. It implies a kind of a break in constitutionalism in the widest sense. I think that's sort of what it does mean for Marx. Jerry's point, did Kautsky understand the dialectic? Probably not in which time in his company, I suppose, but I think the dialectic kind of comes to mean for a lot on the radical left after Kautsky's time, the ability to kind of change your mind very quickly, because that's dialectics, you know. It does have that kind of function for it, but it's true, Kautsky doesn't really talk about dialectics very much. I think he is suspicious of the trade union bureaucracy. I mean, I think he does drop the Mannheim resolution, doesn't he? Is that right? Him and somebody else? You don't think it's true? I'm sure I read that somewhere the other day, but I could be wrong in that, you know. Yeah, but of course he does fall out quite badly with Rosa Luxemburg over the general strike and all that kind of business, you know. I think there's a sense where Lars T. Lee really wants to have Kautsky and Lenin more or less agreeing in everything up until the last minute possible, and I think that's difficult actually, you know, because it's not just in what's written down, it's temperament and its conditions. The conditions in Russia are just so radically different, you know. When they talk about the dictatorship of the proletariat, they mean it, you know. They mean it from very early on. This is a society where assassination is a fairly standard part of political discourse, you know. Kautsky just does not think in those terms. He just doesn't, you know. And I think those differences do exist from quite early on. Whether it all comes down to dialectic is another matter. There'll be other thing I'm sure I've missed. This is a point about Workers' Party. And why does he change his mind about coalitionism and this kind of thing? I think it's partly because this is a general problem for the radical left by the end of the Second World War, which is the traditional manual industrial proletariat has stopped growing. You're not leading to an inevitable massive majority anymore, and this becomes a problem. I think before the war it's kind of straightforward. You think the proletariat's going to grow, and other classes will disappear. What you get by 1916, 1917, 1918 is revolutionary crises, but even when socialists max out the vote, as they effectively do in Germany, you hit about 45%. You can't really go beyond that. There's a fundamental problem for radical socialists. They're in a minority. And there's different ways you can deal with that. One way is to cut a kind of deal with the revolutionary peasantry, and then when they start withholding food, you start repressing them. You know, there's a Bolshevik line which essentially leads to civil war. That's not really available outside Russia because the peasantry are not revolutionary outside Russia. So there's a fundamental problem of what do you do. One thing is simply not to come into power. The other alternative is to come into power, but not to construct socialism, but to construct a kind of democracy which is friendly to socialism. And a lot of socialists try to do this. I think that's Kautsky's line. In that respect, it does owe something to what he's writing in April 1917. He's not talking about a socialist government. He's intimating something different, which is a democracy which is friendly to socialism. But I think there's a genuine conundrum for all of the radical left from 1916 onwards, which is they're not in the majority without much any prospect of becoming one. That's the problem. So it's either compromise, staying out of power, or civil war. And anything you do works out badly, by the way. You know, you either get horrible civil war, or ultimately you get fascism. There's no good alternatives. Well, thanks. Great points, everyone. And I'll not be able to cover everything. I did discuss them the first time, say on the immigration thing. Yeah, I was slightly having some fun with Kautsky there, and even that barbarism quote has to be seen in the context of its own time. You know, and Kautsky is liberal in these things. We have to be sensitive too, though, to a great deal of disconcerting material from the period of the Second International and beyond, of course. I mean, Otto Bauer, who I've got a lot of time for, in his very interesting book on socialism, the national question, and so on, he talks about Austria-Hungary, and he says, well, all these groups in Austria-Hungary have got cultures, and these cultures should be encouraged and developed and allowed to become a national identity. This applies to all groups in Austria-Hungary except for the Jews, because the Jewish culture, which is excessively bound up with usury, petty exploitation, and that therefore to develop a Jewish national identity would be regressive, in contrast to every other group. And instead they should become assimilation, they should assimilate, they should become assimilated Jews as opposed to take pride in a compromised identity. Ottobar himself was Jewish, so it's kind of shocking to read. The English translation of it's very interesting, because the guy who does the introduction spends ages trying to demonstrate that this isn't anti-Semitic. Well, it is. But so at least you should be wary of it. Though the wider point you make, absolutely, if you want to find people who are non-discriminatory, you're going to find them in the Second International. That's for sure. Lots of stuff about this, about dictatorship of the proletariat and what it meant. I think it relates a lot to what Mike was saying about the nature of the state, which Kautsky really didn't want to grapple with. The real problem of the functionaries of the state is a bureaucracy in the widest sense. Bureaucracy, civil service, judiciary, army, police. You could also add on to that, actually, people who exert social control, social discipline. So you're really adding on to this period much of the press, most academics, landowners and industrialists and so on, who effectively have kind of got power state control over people. It's a huge, elaborate network of functionaries, which is extremely problematic. And I think when Marx talks about dictatorship of the proletariat, he means turfing them out. One parallel to this, and coming back to the American Revolution, but what interestingly develops out of the American Revolution is precisely that attitude to bureaucratic functionaries, which is the people you inherit from the old regime are compromised. They may pretend to be loyal to the Republic, but they're not. You need to punt them out. And then indeed, as you get democratization in the various states in the young United States, there's quite a lot of conflict between the old Whig order, and you want to get the old Whig bureaucrats out. The magistrates and the officials and this, that and the other. And what develops famously or infamously in America is the spoils system, that every time a party comes into power, they sack all the old civil servants and bring in their own people. And the sheriff is elected, and the judge is elected, and a radically democratic state apparatus is the tradition which develops in America, which reaches a peak and massively overlaps with corruption in the late 19th century and pulls back a bit. But even to this day, the attitude of the state apparatus is much more democratic than it is in Europe, much more democratic. That certainly applies to the period we're talking about. In the Labour Revolution, Kautsky does make observations about the incompetence and the inefficiency of the bureaucracy. But he kind of says, well, what are you going to do about it? We need these guys, It's a major criticism of the Bolsheviks. He says you can't piss off the bourgeoisie because you need them. When he talks about how the revolution will happen, I think it's in Path to Power, but he kind of says the SPD will win a majority, then the state will attempt a coup to stop them coming into government. But this will be ideal because it will maximise support from the constitutionalists of society behind the SPD. The middle classes and the functionaries and the bureaucrats will all come in behind the SPD because they'll be so offended at the violation of the constitution. And in a way, you'll have the SPD coming into power, leading the 99% behind them. This is delusional at the time. There's a fundamental problem. It's not primarily in the grand historical sense a matter that the reactionary bureaucracy and social power in society, it's not so much that they're opposed to socialism. After the First World War in most of Europe, they're opposed to democracy full stop. These are the people who opened the door to fascism. They opened the door to fascism, pretty much literally, and they'll come in, Mr. Mussolini, let's have a chat about you being in government, The amount of, there's hardly any purging of the state bureaucracy by the fascist regimes in the interwar period, because they don't have to, because they're sympathetic, because they like order. They might think that this corporal with the funny toothbrush moustache is a bit much, but nonetheless it's order, it's stability. There is in fact a crushing of the state apparatus in most European countries in the 20th century. It happens because most of them collaborate with fascism, either fascism in power, or they collaborate when Germany invades. And what you do have actually is a very substantial and quite bloody purge of the state apparatus in continental states from about 1944 to 46. The purge is at the end of the war. And now plenty of dodgy people crawl back in again and work for NATO and develop the American moon program and all the rest of it. But nonetheless, there's a radical reconstitution of the state apparatus. In some respects, I think this is what Marx always had in mind when he talks about the dictatorship of the proletariat. He means that you have to get rid of this apparatus and displace them. But it must be said, this is a deeply difficult thing to conceive of, or difficult to manage in the immediate post-war period, because without the immediate social collapse, and you have civil war, and a civil war which outside Russia you will almost certainly lose, because socialists don't have the majority of the electorate. In Germany, they get 45%, which is bloody good, but still not a majority. But more fundamentally, they have the state apparatus against them, and the people who know how to fire guns and how to organise militarily and how to sabotage things. So in some respects, what is the dictatorship of the proletariat? It's a bit like, on a much bigger scale, deselection of MPs in the Labour Party. It's about removing people who know how to do their jobs but are a block. Of course, if you deselect lots of MPs in the Labour Party, what you'll have is maybe a Labour Party split. What you'll certainly have is a lot more inefficiency. This is already evident with Corbyn in power. He's not very efficient at how to run a party because he's never had any experience of doing it. If you get rid of most MPs, you'd have all kinds of shambolic stuff happening. It would be but the argument is that you get nowhere until you remove these people. Imagine that, expand it massively. You'll get disorder, you'll get corruption, probably, as America seems to indicate, and you'll get all kinds of problems. In that sense, but nonetheless, really, if you wanted to stop fascism after the First World War, you would have had to have done that. And that's what does happen in the Second World War and the immediate post-war period. It's why we live in a moderately democratic Europe now. It wasn't just a nice idea, it was storm and steel, and it was purging. In that sense, I think dictatorship of the proletariat in Marx's mind goes beyond simply majority rule. It means the disintegration of the state apparatus. It doesn't mean executions and all that kind of stuff, but it does mean people being chucked out of jobs and whinging and moaning about it. And it's also difficult because there's no socialist who reckons nationalise everything or socialise everything. At the time we're talking about, any conceivable socialism after the assumption of power by the proletariat, the construction of socialism is something which takes quite a length of time to do. And Marx had always said this. It means you have ingrained social power, which is opposed to. So difficult. On Austria, I think the Austrians get close to being, I know the centrists, but I'm quite sympathetic to centrism, but Austria gets close to the right idea about it, which is you keep the workers' councils, you have an armed workers, and you intimidate them. But in the end, they can't pull it off in Austria alone. But it's much better than the German majority socialist point of view, which is you appease them, you leave the apparatus in power, and you go around killing communists in order to placate them. If that had worked to the extent that democracy might have emerged out of it, you might say, well, it's brutal, but hey ho, brutal things happen. No, it doesn't. Nazism emerges out of that. And Mike's, it is hypothetical history, I suppose, but I just can't imagine anything worse happening in Europe than actually happens. Can't imagine it. What? 3 Hitlers? A second bit, as a theme which came up, I think the second order that, what makes, and we talked about it a bit already, what makes workers socialists? So what do people, what's a socialist consciousness about? I think it's always difficult in this period. I mean, again, Mike is making the point about, itinerant masons, and the point about striking on a ship, that kind of thing. What's notable about that is that masons, they know what they're doing. They work as a group, as a team, and you have a foreman, but a foreman simply just coordinates. Or in a ship, a sailing ship, as we know from mutinies, you don't need the captain to run a ship. The role of the captain is not to run the ship; it's to tell you where to go, and to discipline, that kind of stuff. But sailors know how to run a ship, as poor old Captain Bligh found out. You'll get rid of him and off it sails. It's notable that the most successful efforts at cooperative production in the early 20th century in Germany, Britain, and Ireland, it's done by builders. Because again, builders basically they're not dealing with massively complex technology they don't understand. They know how to make a house. What becomes problematic is when you get mass production on a mass scale, which is difficult for any worker to have any sense of its entirety at all. And in a way, to be honest, that is what Marx predicted. Marx does predict that kind of economic gigantism, and I think Kautsky's pessimism, and it is a pessimism about the capabilities of workers, derives in some respects out of an expectation that production gets more and more massive. I think historically, and that's I think is largely true for the period from the First World War to the 1950s or 60s. It's largely true. It's difficult to see in most forms of mass production workers having very much effective impact upon on managing the mode of production. And it's why I think it helps to explain why there's really quite a dramatic change in socialism. Socialists up to maybe about 1870, there's virtually no socialist conceives of the state running production. Constantin Piqueur maybe is the only one, this French Catholic socialist. But other people, Blanc, Lassalle, they're all talking about if the statist role, which is to help set up cooperatives. That just dies off after 1870, gets a bit of a revival from syndicalism and that kind of stuff. Again, dies off again by the 1920s, It's partly because the nature of production changes, it becomes gigantic. And I think this is a problem. It tends to lead to the theory of Kautsky, which is a bit of a miserable theory, there's only freedom outside work, or the even more miserable reality of Stalinist Russia. I'm not even going to Pol Pot, but I think now one can be a lot more optimistic, because in fact what's happened is that capital remains concentrated, but the workplace has got a lot smaller, a lot more manageable. There's much less requirement actually to deal with this kind of overarching technology, because technology now, IT technology, is mostly about individual interaction or small group interaction. So nobody might have an overall view of the global system. How does the internet work precisely? But the point is, you know how to use the internet. In that sense, actually, I think worker democratic kind of articulation at work, and a work which is emancipatory and liberating, is much more conceivable in the mode of capitalism we live in now than it was for the period about 1920 to about 1960. The downside, however, is that a working class which is able to sabotage, or rather crudely, when I say sabotage, I mean workers able through a strike to stop factories, that kind of stuff. That's much more difficult to do now. So we have an irony, I think, where the possibilities of a democratic socialism are better than they've ever been, coinciding with the lowest strike rate since figures began. I don't know if that's an optimistic or pessimistic note on which to end, but it's quite a far distance from Kautsky. Oh, thank you.